unfortunately, because of the new travel restrictions, because of the Omicron strain, he had to cancel his visit last night itself. On the dais with us, we have Dr. Jacob and Professor Lama. Dr. Jacob will be moderating the session, and Professor Lama will be closing the session. So I'll hand it over to Dr. Jacob.
Thank you, Disha. Good evening to you, Ambassador Tariq Karim. Good to have you join us, at least on Zoom. Ambassador Karim was, of course, supposed to be, as he just mentioned, deliver the address in person today. But because of the confusion around the restrictions in Delhi, I think he's probably made the right call, but by not taking the flight. Ambassador Karim is currently the director of the Center for Bay of Bengal Studies at Independent University, Bangladesh. He specializes in matters relating to ecological security and environmental issues, political Islam, and countering violent extremism. As a career diplomat, he served as the High Commissioner of Bangladesh to India from 2009 to 2014, and Ambassador of the United States from 2001 to 2002, and also to Iran and South Africa. Ambassador Karim is widely known as the architect of the new age of India-Bangladesh relations. He's played a very important role in the India-Bangladesh negotiations relating to electricity cooperation, land border agreement, and of course, issues relating to water sharing between the two countries. Ambassador Karim, it would have been wonderful to have you here in Delhi. This is also an important year and an important month for India-Bangladesh relations, particularly for Bangladesh, this being December 2021. So we will request you to speak for about 35 minutes or so, and then we will have a brief question and answer session, after which I will hand it over to Dr. Mahathir Lama. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. Am I audible? Yeah, okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Jacob, for your kind remarks and welcoming remarks to me. I wish to first of all thank General Huda, the founder of the Council for Strategic Defense and Research, you, Dr. Jacob, Dr. Tisha Khilare, and members of the CSDR, my old and very good friend, Dr. Mahindra Lama. It's really good to see you again, whose persuasive note induced me to actually accept Dr. General Huda's very gracious invitation, but then life intervened. I wish to also thank Herr Volker Lennart Plain and his associates from the Hans Scheidel Stiftung for joining in that invitation to me. Distinguished participants and invitees, ladies and gentlemen, I thank the CSDR and the HSF for honoring me by inviting me to give this special address to this important and timely stakeholders conference. I'm very happy to note that many other good friends have been part of this program, notably among them Ambassador Veena Sikri, Dr. Uttam Kumar Sinha, Dr. Deepak Gyawali, Ambassador Manjeev Puri, Dr. Pradipto Ghosh, and Mr. Tapas Paul, among others. If I missed out any, please forgive me. My sincerest apologies to all for not being here in person. Why are we talking about new regionalism? Frankly, I find this personally somewhat ironic. Actually, for several millennia, until 14th August 1947, our region was the most integrated region in the world, until we decided to kill it and morph ourselves overnight into becoming the least integrated globally. Not that we perhaps harbored some regrets after committing that heinous act. There have been several attempts since the mid-80s with varying degrees of commitment of trying to replicate the act of resurrection. But we haven't yet got the magic formula right that will do that. Why are we talking about new regionalism? For several millennia, the peoples of this ancient civilizational and great subcontinent had lived together like one large, very extended, irrepressibly rambunctious joint family. As in joint families, which many of us may still have some lingering memories of, we tended often to be boisterous lot, made love as well as quarreled with each other. Sometimes we walked away from each other in a huff, but then constantly could not stop thinking about each other before finally returning to hug each other. I would argue, and one may or may not agree with me, our history of those several millennia together as such a gigantic joint family is marked largely by longer periods of peaceful coexistence than periods of internecine strife. So why did we commit regional harakiri? Let me give you an enigmatic one-word answer. Westphalia. Of course, the process did not happen overnight. For over 200 years of the rule over us, our erstwhile colonial lords and masters are much to be blamed, but are we not ourselves far more culpable? The vicious narrative of the 1930s perhaps may be pinpointed as the tipping point that led us to the point of no return. Let me be deliberately provocative here. Of late, I have found the vicarious pleasure of being consistently and loudly so for some time. I have always held the view that the advent of the Westphalian order in Europe actually set into motion and not only the colonial age coming into being, but also that disastrous reaction of centrifugalism in vast Darul Harb or the nether regions of the European Westphalian region. Imagine the merry old order of Asterix and the like, forbidden to foray into neighboring lands anymore to carry out glorious raids for wine, women, and much needed goods. After 1648, that was, well, verboten. But Homo sapiens, being what the species is, are always in a state of perpetual discontent, always needing more than what they have and seeking more from somewhere else. Not able to continue with the practice of raiding neighboring tribes, he must find distant tribes and distant places to raid. Voila, the age of colonialism set in. How do you ensure that the invaded subspecies do not coalesce and fight against you? Make them fight against each other. Colonialism's sensuous but disrupting entry is something which cannot be ignored. That's very much embedded in what our quest is today and why we are not able to achieve it. It did not conquer us in one fell swoop. Whenever long ago, almost a lifetime ago, when I would be explaining to my children how colonialism disrupted our comfortable old order and ultimately enslaved us through a combination of enticing new lucre and creeping annexation, my precocious but highly intelligent daughter would shoot back at me. Why did we allow them to do that? I would be forced to retrospect over that and ruefully have to acknowledge that had I been born in those strange foreign lands far, far away as a Clive or whoever you choose as your favorite brigand, I would very likely have done exactly what he did. My daughter would riposte and admonish, then don't blame yourself, blame others, blame yourself. Now, there is a point to my rambling, so please bear with me, because this is not something not leading to nowhere. Historians in the audience, I crave your indulgence for such outrageously crass pronouncements. The colonial order itself finally collapsed, exhausted, grown old from excessive habits of dissipation, and bleeding itself to death after engaging in 2 world wars in the 20th century. It is often said that victors decide how history is to be written. I grew up with the new fairy tale that after a couple of years of my birth in 1945, we had all globally emerged into a new world order. It was later that I learned that this new world order was actually the precursor to a brave new world. But somehow my mind could never quite wrap itself around these phantasmagorial fables. Many, many decades later, I met my first epiphany. Had we of the new European global species had we of the non-European global spaces really emerged into a new world order? Or had we almost seemingly overnight become denizens of the post-colonial New Westphalian disorder that we walked into with our eyes wide open, but somewhat befogged? Somewhere along the way, after being co-opted in the sensuous colonial embrace, we had convinced ourselves that the Westphalian order and institutional baggage that accompanied that paradigm was the fastest way to that utopian state of modernity. We also simultaneously discovered multiple identities within ourselves. Our minds became enmeshed in various stages of complex schizophrenia or bipolarism and even multipolarism. Believe me, I know what I'm talking about here as a Bangladeshi. The order of new borders and the resultant disorder is something that we need to understand a little deeply if we want to go to where we want to go. In our previous huge imagined subcontinental joint family, we had no sense of borders or divisions of the larger family home. Yet, we had a good idea of individual space within that home, which we largely mutually respected. We tended to the overall well-being of the upkeep of that common home that we all proudly proclaimed as belonging to, tended to its extensive garden and vegetation, flora and fauna, and also our well-stocked ponds. But in New Westphalia, our increasing familial quarrels led us bang into the ultimate Bollywood soap opera. The family house must be partitioned, as we cannot live with each other anymore. Someone or other is aggrieved with his imagined neglect or deprivation. The elders who imagined they presided over the joint family order decided in the wizened wisdom, draw the lines partitioning the ancient house. So you want to have your own separate spaces and forego all the fun of living together? Okay, so be it. Let the lines be drawn. And they were drawn mercilessly. And thus commenced the new age of discord, the era of the partitioned subcontinent spawned by partitioned minds. And that has held us in its grip, I contend and assert, for the last 7.5 decades. Forgive my somewhat flippant tone, but I thought I might lighten up some of you who have had a long, arduous day of serious discussions. I myself needed some lighting up after several incredibly exhausting and stressful last 10-15 days. With that somewhat heretical and cavalier recapitulation in a nugget of our millennia-old history, ending in screaming, literally tearing ourselves apart in the flesh partition, let me now try and return to ground reality. Transition from the ridiculous to the pretentiously sublime. Seriously emerged in the idea of partition, we partition the land, which is terra firma, drawing a line across a cartographic map that is always possible. Not just across a map on paper, but across a brown and green and multi-splendored lands and peoples and much more. We partitioned our waters. We partitioned our forestry. We partitioned our flora and fauna. And they have still not understood quite their new Westphalian confines. In short, we partitioned the entire ecosphere itself that had nurtured us throughout our lives and the lives of preceding generations for countless millennia across the length and breadth of this vast subcontinent. Most grievously of all, we partitioned our minds and then went on a roll. After the original partition of 1947, not satisfied with one partition, essentially of what had historically constituted one Bengal and one Punjab, because the partition of India was essentially the partition of Bengal and Punjab. We delved into the cesspool of bottomless, cascading series of sub-partitions. To be rigorously true to the Westphalian paradigm, some of our instructional maps even depict rivers emerging out of nowhere from where the partition zone begins and vanishing somewhere where the other end of the zone ends. And I have seen such instructional maps, I think in one school, which prepares officers sitting for the IAS and IFS exams, etc. Nature poured these waters from high above within those strictly drawn borders, and mysteriously they vanish back into thin air where those borders end. Of course, this Westphalian logic, once on a roll, has no end. We have defined a national, sovereign, and inviolable airspace, oceanic space, and may even extend it to the space of the universe. The larger partition into separate, inviolably sovereign nation states has also made deep inroads into within the national geospace of an entity. Ironically, the lines of distinction between the external have become so blurred and indistinct, they even intrude within the domestic realm of the nation state itself. Those in possession of a territorial space so defined very jealously and zealously protect their subspaces, allowed them by this rationale, as zealously as the national entity does its own defined national borders from other similarly defined sovereign entities. Why did our efforts at recapturing some essence of a previous togetherness of regional cooperation have such consistent failure? Perhaps the seeds are somewhere if you parse what I have said above, because it is a state of the mind, how we look at the world, how we look at ourselves, how we look at the other, and the other is someone we have created ourselves. That is the tragedy that we face in South Asia. Now, the imperatives for regional cooperation have always preoccupied us, even after we split ourselves and declared ourselves mutual enemies. Perhaps we were inspired by the examples of the EU and ASEAN, but a quarter century on, we have not really achieved, or SAARC, we set in place SAARC in 1985. And I was very much a part of the process that helped in the initial formulation of ideas. I was in New Delhi when the first summit took place in Dhaka. We have not really achieved much substantially in the scale that we had hoped to. The main reason for this have been the continuing India-Pakistan hostilities, the legacy of mistrust of each other, not just between India, Pakistan, but between the other states in the region, and an overarching fear on the part of the smaller countries of overbearing domination by India. That is something that you cannot deny if you look at the map. The map, in fact, if anyone looks at the map and stands where he is in the center of where he belongs in that map, he is bound to look around and everything will affect him. That is human nature. That's how the human mind works. So we have to keep that center stage. And perhaps I'm saying this deliberately to a largely Indian audience, because I think this weighs very, very heavily. I have been a champion and an advocate, and Mahendra knows how I really worked my butt off trying to get things together. But constantly, despite all efforts, I keep coming and hitting my head against this wall. Why have we failed? The shackles of unanimity in decision-making, and I'm referring to why SAARC failed. The politics of hostility, the deep mistrust between neighbors, India-Pakistan relations cast clouds over cooperative efforts on the smaller strait. The SAARC was totally opposed to any form of sub-regionalism. There was some initial euphoria, perhaps around the late, early or mid-2000s of a peace process, but that did not yield instant gratification at all. In fact, it yielded no gratification. This also cast clouds of our cooperative efforts on smaller scale of sub-regional cooperation. But it was clear to many that our challenges in the region would increase exponentially if we failed to acknowledge and address them. Now I will digress a little before coming back to the main theme. Having studied and taught ecological security and environmental politics and policies when I was doing my postgraduate studies. After a hiatus of almost 37 years, I came across a thesis propounded by a Canadian environmental scientist, Thomas Homer Dixon. He wrote in 2000, and he had actually studied the water problems in South Asia. He had come to India and Bangladesh and visited Nepal and the others, and trekked along or visited the regions of the Ganges and the Brahmaputra. And he propounded what at that time to many seemed an outrageous idea. As human population grows, global economic output may also grow exponentially, but renewable resources will decrease sharply. He predicted depletion of aquifers, rivers, and other water resources. He predicted significant climate change and decline of food production and fisheries. He predicted environmental scarcities that were already contributing to conflict situations. Continuing scarcities and pressures will increase demands on states and their institutions, rendering adversely affected states fragile and causing them to circle the wagons. States will likely fight more over renewable, such as water, forestry, agrarian resources, than non-renewable resources in the future. Intrastate conflicts are likely to expand into interstate conflicts. I think many years later, this he wrote in 2000, and I was reading this 5 or 6 years later. And the more I look at what we have driven ourselves into and where we are today as we face the multitude of problems, particularly when I look at what's happening in the COP meetings and elsewhere, I see that this man perhaps was prophetic. He did what should be a cardinal principle for those looking at environment and ecology. He was indulging in what my mentor at the University of Maryland told me, anticipatory thinking. Unfortunately, that is something which is in very, very short, if not non-existent supply in most leaderships and most bureaucracies all over the world. By 2050, the demographic situation in the region, one could see from various projections, will provide impetus for significant increases in non-traditional security challenges in an area already coping with various kinds of ecological security. And so now let me zoom into our own sub-region that we are very much a part of, and how do we deal with it? It's the BBIN region. Is it likely scenario for above to play out? The situation has exacerbated, to say the least. My mentor, Professor Dennis Pereges, he passed away last year. He and I worked together in an exercise with the National Bureau of Asian Research between 2009 and 2012. And essentially, we were focusing on non-conventional security and how climate change and all these different factors were going to increase the risks of non-traditional security, perhaps ultimately translating into security, traditional security threats. He wrote a paper to which I had to respond in that workshop in 2010, in 2011 in Colombo, Sri Lanka. Okay, this was held in Dhaka, then in Colombo, then in New Delhi, and finally at the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington. The total global population, now a little over 7.3 billion, is expected to reach 8.5 billion by 2030, top 9.7 billion by 2050, and shoot to over 11 billion by 2100. These are figures not by him, because I got these later, from the UN ECOSOC 2015 dataset. Significantly, South Asia, that is the region comprising Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Maldives, Nepal, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka, has currently, and currently still doubted, it's about 7 years old, a combined aggregate total of over 1.743 billion, registering a staggering 336% increase over a mere 476 billion in 1950. It will almost double its present numbers by 2050. The burgeoning demographic youth bulge is a factor of critical importance. The World Development Report of the World Bank of 2007 had predicted the numbers of young people aged 12 to 24 would continue to rise inexorably over the next 20 years, it numbered in 2007, 385 million. It was predicted to increase to around 435 million in 2030. Again, this is the World Bank report of 2007. Demographic changes, particularly population growth, can be the most destabilizing factors when rapidly growing societies pose unsustainable demands on the existing capabilities of nature and natural resources. Ecological and non-traditional security depends on maintaining not only a dynamic equilibrium among human species or societies, but far more importantly between humans and nature, humans and other species, and humans and, please note in today's context and the Omicron context, humans and pathogens. Non-traditional security or ecological crises have been responsible for killing and injuring substantially larger numbers of people over time than conventional military threats. Therefore, they represent a parallel and arguably a more important source of insecurity. Global warming will have a major impact on all four intertwined relationships that define ecological security. Coastal areas will be at greater risk, and we are a coastal nation. We have a pretty long coastline compared with some other countries relative to our size. While warming will permit pests and pathogens to move beyond the traditional regions, disruption of the fragile equilibrium could increase societal conflicts. Events have since vindicated both Pirage's forebodings in West and South Asia, and South Asians need to take heed to safeguard their own future. What are these challenges that we identified in that workshop in 2011? Ecological and environmental security were at the very top, followed by water, because that underlies all other forms of security that we are dependent on. Whether it's food security or energy security or employment security or health security, in some way or the other, water is connected with everything. And of course, we also talked about, and this is, remind you, in 2011, we talked about wildcard events and what we should do to stave them out, which included cyclones, tidal bores, tsunamis, earthquakes, and believe me, pandemics. When nobody else anywhere was thinking about pandemics, and nobody knew that in 2020, this was going to hit us, having conveniently forgotten that the last such did hit mankind a century ago, we discussed this scenario. What do we do? Because globalization has made time and space irrelevant. We have broken the lines that separated humans from pathogens. And so obviously somebody is going to be at the receiving end. Regional ecological, well, I was asked, and this was a futures exercise. We were talking in 2010 about what would South Asia do faced with a cascading series of these things happening by extrapolating what existed in 2009 when the paper was first being drafted. What would happen in 2025? And I was asked to give my thoughts of how South Asia should be coping with it. So I wrote a paper which some thought, which some took more realistically than it was meant to be. I said, look, by 2025, we have learned our lessons well. We have come together and we have decided that together we will have formed by 2025 an authority called the Regional Ecological and Environmental Security Authority. That was, and I called it the SARISA, South Asia Regional Economic Environmental Security Authority. Later on, when I was asked, why do you call it authority? I said, no, I'm not interested in associations. I've seen where they are. They are just clubs where you meet, old boys clubs, you have a few drinks, you pat each other in the back, you hug, and then you go out and curse each other. I want an authority which will identify the problems, which will monitor, which will pass laws and regulations, which will monitor the observance of the laws and regulations, and which will impose sanctions and punish those who transgress them. Without that, we are not going to be go anywhere. Of course, this was outrageous idea at the time. And I know when I presented this in New Delhi, I don't know, where was it, at the Maurya Sheraton, I think we held that meeting. There was a fierce pushback by the Indian Foreign Ministry, India MEA representative whom we had invited to talk. We can't give up sovereignty. Okay, so that was reality check. How can you give up your sovereignty? Because you have to give up your sovereign rights to cede those rights to a body like this. And I gave in details. Perhaps I went so much into details that there was a former foreign secretary of Sri Lanka and a very, very respected and senior colleague from a think tank in Sri Lanka sitting next to me. They asked me, where is the website of this organization? And I had to say, sorry, that site is still in my head. It's far from being a website. How do we, and for each of the items I listed, I said, that overall body has to set up a sub body which will monitor the actions and way to follow in tackling each of these. And we will have such a sub-commission or sub-body under the SARISA, which will ensure water security. And that basically meant basin management of waters, and whether it related to groundwater, surface water, rainwater, aquifers, etc., everything. Now that was unthinkable, but we have to today think of the unthinkable. We've already lost a lot of time, but we have to at least contemplate the unthinkable if we are to avoid slipping into the precipice, which is perilously close to us. The challenges since then have exacerbated greatly. The water supplies are tighter. Even in my own country, people in India used to say, oh, you have so many rivers, you have so much water, why do you have a shortage? Go and visit some of my coastal cities. I have visited Satkhira, right next to Khulna. That's right on the coast. You see the Bay of Bengal from there. There are women in the villages lined up at the tube wells, but waiting for a truck to bring fresh water from the city. Why? Because the tube well water is saline. And this is several years ago. So this has exacerbated. There was a report recently that there is increased displacement, internal displacement in Bangladesh. There are about 40,000 climate refugees adding to Dhaka's already bulging population, 40,000 every year. Now, I don't know for how many years they measured it, but let us say they measured it for the last 5 years. So that makes 2 million population already added. Now, if we go back to IPCC predictions in 2007, they had said Bangladesh would lose 20% of its coastline. Well, I don't know whether we have lost 20%, yes, but yes, I can see the visible signs of how much we are losing, how close the sea has encroached to what was previously far away from the seashore. This internal displacement will keep adding up. It will test the capacity of even the best of governments to be able to handle it. And so, in a sense, at that point of time, and there will be a tipping point somewhere, we will be faced with exodus. I remember in one of the books given to me as extra reading, this was perhaps in 2005, it was a sort of science fiction book which said some French cities on the coast, the population had amassed there, and we're looking at several ships anchored offshore containing refugees from Bangladesh and elsewhere who wanted to come in. Now, that was science fiction in those days. I know from my own experience growing up that almost 90% of science fiction today is reality. So as I said, challenges continue. They have exacerbated greatly. Global warming and sea level rise is happening inexorably, whatever naysayers say so. There's continuing glacial melt, and I know that Deepak Gyawali from Nepal and our friends from Nepal and Bhutan will testify to that the third pole is actually shrinking. I knew from a study I had done in 2007 that we had lost more in 40 years of these glaciers than we had in the previous 400 years. How many minutes am I away from 35?
Maybe 2 more minutes, sir.
Okay, so I'll now try and rapidly cover some ground. Bangladesh took seriously this because we are an endangered species. Maldives will go under entirely, but Bangladesh will be closely following on the heels of Maldives. It will not go under totally, but it will go under considerably. I thought to myself, how do we actually get to knock our heads together, sit down and arrive at some form of cooperation when SAARC has failed? And looked at the European and ASEAN examples, and I thought, well, those two grew by an organic process of accretion. So first we have to try and do that. We can't take the big leap forward. We have to do it block by block. Let us approach sub-regionally. We may have to change the tactics. And I think this conference is exactly what I have been trying to do since I was High Commissioner in 2009. And Mahendra will be a testimony. So indulge me 2 or 3 minutes more. I'll quickly go over that. When Sheikh Hasina became the Prime Minister in 2009, we used to have discussions before then. I said, listen, we are going to have problems on water sharing forever. It was during your time that we resolved the Ganges Treaty, and that's the 30-year treaty. And today, just 4 more years left to the treaty expiring. We haven't done anything on the remaining 53 rivers. And of course, between her first term then and now her 4th term, the Teesta is still hanging fire. So we are not ever going to get all of these resolved. We will continuously have disputes over these waters. But think of it another way where we could perhaps come together. How did we live and manage these waters and never had problems on sharing or whatever you call it? because sharing, and that's the partition syndrome. That's why it dwells so flippantly on that, in that portion. We partition the rivers. The rivers are not. I had my real epiphany sitting in a conference room in the office of the Vice Minister for Water Affairs in China in January 1989. There was a delegation from Bangladesh visiting. I had accompanied them as the acting ambassador to set the ball rolling and start before we went into opened our files and started discussing. I asked the Vice Minister just a simple question. It was the icebreaker. Excellency, how did you tame your river of sorrows? And I'm sure most of you know what I'm referring to. And with his typically inscrutable face and expression, he said something in Mandarin, which is translated in one word: manpower. So my secretary said, "Excuse me, Excellency, what do you mean by that?" I asked a question about you taming a river. She said, yes, for not decades or centuries, for millennia, this river has been a river of sorrows. We did something here, the river would flow around it. We did something there, the river would smash through it, until we finally realized that every river is a force of nature. Every river has its own personality. You cannot ever tame a river. You can at best train a river. These were the 4 points, and the punchline was, we have manpower. We ordered our manpower along the banks, both the banks of the river, from the headwaters to the mouth simultaneously. Mark my words, headwaters to the mouth simultaneously on both banks. And we trained the river. It still causes problems for us. It still overflows. It still does some damage, but it is manageable. And that was the time when epiphany, as I said, the light lit up in my brain. Okay, that river is entirely within China's sovereign domain. We have divided our rivers into several sovereign domains, and within one sovereign domain, it has been subdivided into sub-sovereign domains. What we cannot do within ourselves, we apply the same to others. And therefore, we advocated to India, and Indians accepted it in the wisdom of the time, that okay, on the Ganges, we will discuss not bilateral anymore, but we will discuss with Bangladesh and Nepal. Brahmaputra, we will discuss with Bhutan and Bangladesh. If China joins at some point of time, they will join. And then it stopped. We started the first Joint River Commission meeting at ministerial level was held 2 months later, and then it stopped. When I was with the World Bank in 2015, I organized a meeting to the Mississippi River Commission project in the US, persuaded Bhutan to come, even persuaded, I thought I had. There was a big Bangladesh delegation there. There was a big Bhutanese delegation there, but we had to play Hamlet without the Prince of Denmark. Nobody turned up from India. How do you do basin management if India is not part of it? The whole purpose was to see if we could reimagine how a basin is managed. What happens? Are there problems between upper riparians, lower riparians? Bhutan was first, frankly, skeptical. So what do we as an upper riparian have to worry about? And then they said, thank you for persuading me to come, because I see we also have a problem. Now that is where we are stuck. We were proceeding until that process stopped. Now, we have to go into this seriously if you want to, because whatever we do or do not do with the waters will affect the climate change. And if we cannot address that, it will affect our relations also. This is a consuming preoccupation in the minds of many. Now that I'm living here for over 4 years, I can feel the pulse of the people more closely. Previously, for 20 years, I was just coming and going. Thank you. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Ambassador, for that masterly presentation on the past, present, and future of the South Asian regional security problematic as it were. Thank you for your deeply thoughtful, statesmanlike, and provocative presentation. I think what is more important for me is that you sort of spoke like a true South Asian and not really as a citizen of a specific country. I have very quickly two questions to you, and then I'll sort of open up the discussion to the floor. After that, I will go back to Professor Lama for his concluding remarks. Very quickly, Ambassador, today, one of the major themes that almost every speaker touched upon was the issue of bilateral trust deficit, be it India, Bangladesh, India, Nepal, or with any other country, even while negotiating the so-called non-traditional security issues. You have been a key negotiator between India and Bangladesh. What has been your experience of this trust deficit? How deep does this run in the respective establishments? And my second question is also a slightly related one. There was a time when we believed that it was easier to negotiate non-traditional security issues, like water or climate, rather than traditional security issues like the size of your nuclear arsenal or Kashmir or things of that kind. But that doesn't seem to hold true anymore. The so-called non-traditional security issues have become increasingly securitized, and domestic populations have actually been drawn into these politically sensitive debates. So what has been your experience while negotiating the thus far unsuccessful Teesta Treaty and the Land Boundary Agreement? I think what I'm trying to get at is really the domestic politicization of the non-traditional security issues as opposed to the traditional security issues and how that impacts on the negotiations. So if you could take just a brief minute or so to answer this, and then immediately go back to the audience.
Okay, so three questions here. The third is a subset of the second. First, the lack of trust. That is at the core of every relationship that has either worked or gone awry. My biggest challenge when I arrived back in India, I'm saying back because I had been here from 84 to 88. I had been part of the water negotiations. I'd sat in on at least 3 sessions of the Joint River Commission meeting, and I knew where we were. During the Ganges Treaty, we found that we were at a certain spot. When I came back in 2009, we had not moved forward after that. Why? And my biggest challenge, I shared this with Mahendra occasionally over chats, was breaking the walls in our mind was far more difficult than breaking the concrete walls that we build outside. And this ran from top to bottom. This translated vertically as well as horizontally. And so rebuilding trust was perhaps my first task, and I had to improvise in trying to do that, get people to meet each other, talk to each other, see each other face to face, because the walls we had set up through our different regulations that prevented people from communicating and going and meeting and traveling had created this chasm which was almost unbridgeable. And I feel gratified that during those years that I had a role to play in helping to reset our relations. We brought it to a place where we were reasonably comfortable. I would say reasonably comfortable with dealing with each other and talking about issues with each other, trying to find solutions rather than harping on the problems. Then I think domestic politics crept in. And I'll be frank, I'm not holding back punches. I have got public on this, and I have friends all over India who can agree and disagree. But seeing it up so close, for me, this has been, I feel angry at times. If everything was internal, and that's why I said I use that word Westphalia, then you should not have intervened in 1971. That's my first and biggest challenge as we are going forward to celebrate the 16th December this year. You should not have. It was an internal matter of Pakistan. That's what it claimed. All right. Now, all of us have a minority-majority problem. This goes back, I placed it at the 30s. That was the tipping point. It has been happening. And that's why I gave that, my somewhat irreverent history of the colonial era here. That's how deep set it is. You react to whatever happens. I have been on the receiving end on this side. How many times has India not asked us, we are worried about the Hindu minorities in Bangladesh. What are you going to do about it? Are you protecting this? And you expect the population over here, which is a majority Muslim population. We are not majoritarian. We are secular. We still think when something happens here, you howl. But our prime minister and civil society and everyone goes out and says, stop this. This is not us. When we see something happening in our neighbors, we react. You cannot help but react. We have, I would say, a kinship, which is which is in our chromosomes. Okay, that chromosome actually overarches the narrative that we have been fed and drilled into our minds of the last 7.5 decades. It is huge. It lurks behind that, our Westphalian concept of each other. So that's one. This trust has been in severe jeopardy in recent times. And I have argued with friends in government and out that if I lose that trust, which it took me so hard to bring to a certain place, and if it slips back, you are going to have 100,000 times more difficult time dragging it back to where you had brought it to. That's psychology. Once bitten, twice shy. So number one. Number two was, what was it?
About negotiating non-traditional, so-called non-traditional security issues like water and climate. Is that
okay?
Domestic politicization?
Yeah. The arms and the nuclear arms and everything, these are objects. These are tangible, visible, countable objects. In the non-traditional area, what you're dealing with is water, forestry, air. These are intangible. You can't see it, you can't touch it, you can't measure it, you can't stop it, you can't, you can't do anything. Can you hold the water flow when where the border intersects into a river? The water flows. Can you measure it there? Can you measure it where it enters your territory? No. So when you are dealing with an intangible, you also behave irrationally. I would say this is of course, psychologists may dispute this, or a political scientist which, but I'm saying this is my gut feeling. I can't do that. How did we manage it before the partition? In fact, we managed it until 1965. We stopped it because after 1965 India-Pakistan war, Pakistan regime sitting in Karachi or Islamabad dropped an iron curtain, literally almost, around the perimeters of the East Pakistan with India. There was river traffic. I remember I came from Kolkata to Dhaka in 1948 or whenever it was, by ship from Kolkata via Golondor to Dhaka. Dhaka is where there's a confluence of the Ganga and the Brahmaputra. And then they join together and become the Meghna and go downstream. one could travel from Guwahati to Kolkata via Bangladesh in the rivers. The rivers, these services were provided by steamship companies which were jointly owned. The steamship companies would regularly dredge the rivers every year. This is what, I'm not saying this now, Sheikh Hasina told me. And I'll say in Bangla, I'll repeat what she said. Baba bolten, prottek botchor, onekgulo dredger asto Guwahati theke, dredge kore Kolkata porjonto jeto. That was river management. My friends, that was river management, because when you are dredging a river to keep it alive and flowing, you have to shore the embankments, you have to make sure the silt does not accumulate, you maintain the ports and everything along it, and you allow a river economy to flourish. That's why what is intangible, I think the human mind is incapable, or it has deadened itself to not being able to deal with the intangible. We are more comfortable dealing with missiles and guns and rockets and tanks and warships and whatever category. Because we can count them, we can say, okay, I have seen you have so many, you take off so many, I'll take off so many. How do you do that with these? So that's the challenge we have to try and overcome first in our own minds, that we want to do it. And if we have that will to go that next step, then perhaps we can go forward.
Thank you. We'll take a few more questions from the audience. Who would like to go first? There's a question at the back there. And of course, what you said after that.
Hello, sir. My question is regard to the transboundary climate change impacts, that is cross-border impacts that can happen in the recent days with related to migration, trade flow, and finance flow, and it can be impact on geopolitics of South Asia. And with regard to the migration, I would say, as you have already mentioned, the displacement of people from Bangladesh or from Maldives, or it can be from Sri Lanka to the Indian side. And this is something we need to think in the perspective of human security and non-traditional security perspective. And my question is that how it will be a security threat for South Asia as a continent, and how this new regionalism can accommodate this issue and how it can be addressed. That's it. Thank you, sir.
Pastor Karim, we'll take a few questions and come back to you.
Yeah, you'll have to parse that for me because I couldn't quite make out the question. Please parse it into 2 or 3 simple lines and.
Sure, sir. How about you?
Good evening, Dr. Karim, Ambassador Karim. This is Tariq again. Probably we have met.
Good evening. Yes, we have.
Times.
How are you?
How are you? Good to see you.
Yeah, I can't see you yet, but I can hear you, and it's good to hear your voice.
Thank you. I have a simple question. I still remember the arrival of President Ziaur Rahman to Kathmandu. It was for 24 hours, and the rousing reception he got there, and with the fanfares which we had for the establishment of SAR. I was still a young officer then. I remember. Now I have become a very old man. I think probably you and me belong to the same age group.
Correct.
We have moved quite a lot, but SAR is still there. And it has not moved. Professor Lama, a young, enthusiastic academician, I wish him all the best. But having worked in the government for some years, also in the research, SARC has not moved now. He's thinking in terms of a new regionalism. What do you think? When SARC has not moved, and for obvious reason. Thank you.
So question at the back.
Hello, sir. My question is regarding, as you said, the things falling under non-tangible, people also behave irrationally. So how do you see these issues like Rohingya, that they have been settled on an island? So do you think that the matter, the year, I think 3 or 4 years back, when in 2017, I think, when this issue was there, so Indian government that time behave irrationally, and how do you see the issue like Rohingya, whether it will come under traditional or non-traditional?
Thank you. Any last question, or we will, yes, over to you, Professor Bhushan. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much for a very thoughtful and very candid presentation. So I just want to go one of the points that you talked about, this joint economic and environmental authority, regional. In my opinion, I feel that this is the way out, because the bilateralism has not worked at all. I'm not sure about the India, Bangladesh and India, Nepal water issues, but I'm very much aware about the India and Pakistan water issues because I live and I research in the Indus Basin. It doesn't bother India. If you look at the Indus Water Treaty, the treaty is going very well, especially from Indian point of view and also from Pakistani point of view. Because if you look at the entitlement that is, allotted to the India, we are not even able to utilize that. For many reasons, but despite that, there are a lot of complaints, concerns from the Pakistani side, which India feels that does not care. But at the same time, those concerns have significantly impacted the relations between these two countries. So, in my opinion, nothing works bilaterally between India and Pakistan. And only way I feel that, before this presentation, we heard some of the thoughts that were saying that small actions at the people's level will make some changes in the attitude of, at the government level. You see, you talked about it 10 years before, and we are, about a decade later, we are nowhere. So what my just question is that, what will it take to the governments, particularly the major players in the South Asia, to really move on this type of, I think this is the only way that, we will have to have this authority that you have talked about. I don't know the details, but it will have sub authorities within this authority that will, deal with the different, bilateral. Suppose Indus will be between India and Pakistan, the others will be between trilateral or bilateral. So what would it require for the countries, particularly the major ones, but India, I would say, to take an initiative on this.
Thank you, Professor Romshu. I think we will go back to Ambassador Karim for his final.
Yeah. If you could, the last questioner just wanted to know, is he a young man, middle-aged man, old man?
Professor Romshu is a senior professor at the Kashmir University.
Okay. He touched a chord in me, because for one person in 10 years has finally said, yes, you're talking sense about having such a body. Okay. So I at least have converted one person. No. Again, the other factors I mentioned earlier, they intervene in our coming together on this. It is always that I will not cede my authority. My concept is, when you are thinking of new regionalism, you also have to factor in, it has to be inherent and inbuilt, that each state coming together will not be ceding authority, they will pool authority. if you can change their thinking from seeding to pooling, they might find it's easier for the brains to wrap itself around that concept. But whenever we talk about that and we talk of setting up something which will be, I mean, this is essentially at the heart of some of the problems the EU is facing, why Britain went out. But in a sense, if you look at EU, and we should look at EU, you know, if you come to Dhaka, you go and opposite the American embassy, there's a building, it has three flags flying side by side. We call it the Franco-German embassy. They built it together. The ambassadors' offices and other officers, their rooms are mixed up. It's not partitioned. They walk across and the European flag is flying. And when I saw that building about 7 or 8 years ago coming up, it was my dream that can India and Pakistan, can we do something together? And when I advocated regional cooperation or sub-regional cooperation, in my mind was that image that can we come to a stage where we can see beyond ourselves. But unfortunately, we became inward looking and we continue to do that. And of course, 5 years of what happened in the US recently sort of elevated the rhetoric of I, me, ourselves. The rest of the world can go to hell. Okay. So while we were making progress, this has intervened. Now, COVID should have brought us back together. It has in some respects, but we need to come together in very basic and fundamental areas like this. Whether such an authority will ever be formed, I don't know. It will be up to the younger generation to take it forward. I'm at the fag years of my life. Dr. Deepak Gyawali and I perhaps are of the same generation, close to each other in age. And we have also gone through these periods. You know, he referred to our hopes in SARC. And I'll address his question next. Why didn't it happen? It didn't happen because if you're talking of multilateralism, multilateral cooperation, if you're talking of regional cooperation, first of all, at least 3 countries have to have reasonably good bilateral relations and engagements with each other. And these countries have to be contiguous to each other. This was our biggest problem, I think, that we faced. India-Pakistan war overshadowed everything else, even in the eyes of the world. When I was posted abroad, I mean, Bangladesh didn't exist. When India-Pakistan came into the discussion, no one else in South Asia existed. So in a sense, what was doable was also ignored because everybody chose to jump into the mess that was the India-Pakistan relations. Number 2, so when I came back in 2009, I understood that, okay, if we need, I advocated sub-regional cooperation strongly when I was Additional Foreign Secretary for South Asia and SARC. In the brief for the SARC summit in 1996, I said, rethink SARC as 3 sub-regions: Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Nepal on the eastern side, India, Sri Lanka, Maldives on the southern side, and India, Pakistan. There was no Afghanistan at that time in 95 when I was preparing the brief, on the western side. And I said, what is the easiest? And I said, that's the most difficult. Like a student going into an exam hall, I said, if I spend my whole time trying to solve that question, I will not be able to attend to any of the easier questions. So I secluded that. I said, okay, I can't deal with it. It's too much for me to handle. Can we do something in BBI? And there were possibilities, but it needed for at least 3 contiguously located countries having fairly stable, good relations. And for Bangladesh-India relations to be reset on the right track, that was my fundamental approach and mandate. If Bangladesh-India relations got on track and started talking to each other, we could get somewhere. The framework agreement signed, Sheikh Hasina's visit 2010 was a game-changing visit. So those interested in this part of the world, look closely at that. I don't know how many paragraph joint communique issued at their departure. I've been dealing with joint communiques all my life. Usually they are pretty bland stuff, 10, 15 paragraphs and that's it. It went into details and nitty-gritty. It identified areas to be addressed and what needed to be done. And then we followed up. For the next 2 years, we followed up. So a lot of things happened during the next 2 years. The next document happened in 2011, September. We signed, the two of us signed the Framework Agreement for Cooperation and Development. And I assert that in our troubled South Asian history, that is a landmark document, which all of us should take a careful look at. Because basically then it enjoined two of the larger entities in South Asia to work together to promote, enhance, and campaign for regional cooperation. Once that was done, then my foremost concentration and task was, how do I get the BBIN together? It is essentially an intergovernmental arrangement. It's not an institutional arrangement. We finally, in December 2012, got the joint secretaries to meet of 3 countries. One did not turn up. The next year, the 4th also turned up. And then it went on a roll for some time. And I think the failure of the SAARC summit of 2014 in Kathmandu, when 2 documents came close to signature. But when I was in India, I said, these will not be signed. Why will they not be signed? Because Prince of Denmark is absent. If Pakistan is not sitting on the talks while the other secretaries agree, it will not happen. And that's what happened. Neither the MVA happened, nor the energy paragraph could go through. Energy paragraph was inserted later when our Prime Minister went and talked one-on-one at the retreat. Then the 4 countries got together and in January 2015 said that we will go for BBIN MVA, and then the BBIN MVA was signed in Bhutan. But then that is the nature of the beast that we are saddled with or riding. It stopped. Now 3 countries have ratified. The 4th has half ratified. Unless it fully ratifies, we cannot do. So now we are working around it, because that agreement also contained the solution for it. That if 3 countries are ready to go, they should proceed. The 4th can join when ready. But just getting that 4th signature to come to say, okay, 3 can go, all 4 have to sign on to this. It's already a signed document. It's stuck there. I'm told it will happen. But we have moved on other areas it identified. It identified that we should also proceed towards a BBIN rail network wherever railways was possible. We will move towards a BBIN waterways network wherever that is possible. And we are moving towards that steadily. With hiccups, lots of hiccups, but it's happening. My own hope is, and perhaps it's a desperate gamble, that you get it rolling, it will develop its own dynamics. And once it develops its own dynamics, it'll just leave your hand and go forward. That's all that I can hope for at this stage of my life. So why didn't SAARC happen? Because 2 of the principal actors in SAARC are bickering and undermine every effort to do anything else that others want to do. So you have to somehow adopt, even the European approach did not call for everyone to join in on everything and sign everything together, whether it's the European Monetary Unit or whatever else. The people who are in the European Union who don't participate in all the activities. That is the flexibility which we denied to ourselves. Once you make it inflexible, you can't move. The number 3, can you, Dr. Jacob, parse the first question and.
Right. So the question essentially was, I think, the impact of non-traditional security issues such as refugee flows and climate change on South Asian security. I think in much of what you said, the answer is self-evident, unless until you want to add a sentence or two. But we will immediately go to Professor Lama. Right.
You think I've addressed that already?
I think you have addressed. I think it's
okay. So
the refugee flows and the climate change are the several security threats to South Asia as a region. But over to you, Professor Lama, for your closing remarks.
Yes, thank you very much, Ambassador Tariq, Karim. As usual, a very frank, very forthcoming, very provocating, and very inspiring lecture. I think you are one of the...
Mahendra, if I may just interrupt 1 second. I think I caught somebody saying about diplomacy. I am frank and candid because I don't do diplomacy with friends. I do it with my enemies. Okay. With friends, we have to be frank to understand each other. We can't be talking past each other. Okay, sorry.
Absolutely, yes. As you rightly said, when you started with how Westphalian system has brought so much of what you call it, intrigues, complexities, and has given rise to inbuilt inflexibility. It is quite clear that that is very clearly reflected in the entire regional cooperation process here. What you also said was the region was integrated, it disintegrated, and today we are trying to reintegrate it. And if you see the historical experimentations on reintegrations across the world, they are most excruciatingly painful exercise and process. This is what is happening in South Asia. We know what kind of dislocations it brought. Say, for example, for the northeast part of India, one could travel to Tripura, Agartala from Calcutta. It took just 300 kilometers odd before 15th August 1947. And the very next day, it became almost 1400 kilometers via Chicken Neck, then Guwahati, then Shillong, then all these destinations. So it is a very, very painful process today, and we would like to go back to that situation again. At the same time, it's very interesting to see your generations, right, who were born before 1947. It's a very unique situation because your generations in your lifetime have got 3 citizenships. Yes. First Indian, then Pakistani, then Bangladesh. And that happens only in South Asia, right?
Exactly.
And the person is the same. So you definitely have, I'm sure, 3 passports. That's what Professor Revan keeps telling me. Hey, man, you have only 1 passport? I have 3 passports, right? So it's a very, very complex and unique situation. The second issue which you really brought into the fore today is how mindsets are much, much formidable or impregnable fortress rather than the real fortresses, right? It's absolutely right. I'll give you one example. I was invited by the Niti Aayog 2 years back to write a vision document for the Northeast region 2035 because we together wrote the 2020 document, and it is supposed to be the Prime Ministers of India's India Vision 2035 part of that. While writing this document, one of these issues of mindsets came into being. Say, for example, you talked about trust deficit, you talked about confidence gap, you talked about reliability, laggardness, then you talked about withdrawal syndrome, how this country, these actors withdraw from the entire system. And it also leads to what we call snail's shell syndrome, that you just take out your heads, move a little bit, and if you see anything foreign, then you tend to withdraw. So this snail cell syndrome is the most prevalent feature in South Asia, right?
Yes, yes.
Now, in creating such kind of deficits, such kind of gaps and laggardness, one of the key issues in South Asia is the state-constructed narrative. I've seen, like, for example, somehow our state in India created a narrative in the last 40, 50 years saying that, hey, don't go to Northeast. It's a land with a lot of violence, it's a land with a lot of all kinds of instabilities, dislocations, and all kinds of things. And today our Prime Minister works very hard to make Northeast as a bridgehead in our lookist policy, actist policy. And he gives everything to the Northeast. You do this, you do that. For the first time, you have multilateral players going to Northeast. World Bank, Asian Development Bank, UNDP, all can go to. This was absolutely a no-go situation about 8 years back. So today, any institution can go. And he has made it compulsory for a union minister to visit Northeast every fortnight, right? So it's absolutely a kind of a go ahead, right, and engage so that it can really work as a kind of a platform for India to move towards the Southeast Asia and also to create a new growth pole in the Northeast. And before 1947, in 1920s, of course, Northeast was one of the prominent growth poles. But when you do something, try to do something in the region, let's have a supply chain, let's have a kind of electricity grid, power pool there, integrating Nepal, Bhutan, right? You see people withdrawing, policymakers absolutely feeling shy about doing anything, right? And again, the mindset of what you call security would come in. So it's a very difficult situation for us today to break it. So as scholars working in this area, we have now started a new narrative known as reverse integration. I forget that narrative. Reverse integration is, so far we said, in Northeast India should integrate with rest of India. And what is rest of India is metropolis like Calcutta, Delhi, Madras, Mumbai. What we are saying is let rest of India integrate with Northeast now. And we have a kind of a personification as far as map is concerned. If you see our map, Northeast India is the head of the chicken neck is there, and after the chicken neck, head is that side, and the body is this side. So the body is the rest of India, right? Actually, the body is the rest of India, and the head is, chicken's head is Northeast. So far, body drove the head. When you say that integrate with India, rest of India, body was trying to drive the head. And that was, all the complexities came because of that. So what we are saying is changing the narrative, let the head drive the body, right? So, and that is to a large extent, I think people are now talking about it, discussing about it. So, but it is a very, very difficult process. You have seen personally as a kind of a widely respected diplomat, you have seen it as a kind of a very well-known scholar also. I also agree with you how some of the Indian delegates really registered your move about Sharisa, the authority part of it. I was a witness because I participated in that meeting. So I clearly remember when you referred to the ceremony scholar and the foreign secretary, I was telling him both the names, but I don't want to make it public. And I also know whom you are referring to as our Indian heads. But what to do? That is the situation. But see, one of the greatest hopes for all of us, particularly in the civil society, is if you protractedly and if you consistently work, you will come to a logical end. You are bound to hit the target. You know, the debate about the basin-based river development, river basin-based integrations initiated in 1980s. I remember George Verghese, right? QK Ahmad, Kaligujur Ahmad from the BUP, Bangladesh Unnayana Parishad, and Mohammed Sanju and Begwadur Thapa from IIDS, Integrated Development Systems from Nepal, made an absolutely solid effort that time. I was a student that time in JNU, so I used to look forward to what would happen. And that triggered a whole lot of debate about reservoirs. Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi called the meetings in Kathmandu, so we are fully aware of that. But more than that, it gave a shape to what you call it South Asia Growth Quadrangle as a sub-regionalism process. And in 1997, I remember Professor Mujkund Dubey, the former Foreign Secretary, Professor Revan Sovan, Lokras Baral, we came together and published a volume on Growth Quadrangle for the first time. So then that brought the entire idea of Eastern South Asia, right? And you know that how it evolved into what today we call as BBIN. My third point to you is, how prepared are we to really receive the climate change induced migrants? You said, you told us the scale, you told us the speed, and you also told us the gravity of situations. And when we think about our absorbing capacity in South Asia, we have a very contrasting features. Look how we have treated refugees as per their backgrounds. Refugees are refugees, right? We treat Lotsambas, the Bhutanese refugees, in a different manner, the Tamils in a different manner, Tibetans in a different manner, Rohingyas in a different manner, right? The Chakmas. So we have treated all 10, 15 groups of refugees in an absolutely different manner, precisely because we don't have, in India, we don't have a national law to deal with refugees and migrants, right? In India is not a signatory to both the 51 Convention and the 1967 Protocol on Refugees. And that is the case with Pakistan. That is the case with Bangladesh, Nepal, Bhutan, right? Under that situations, when you don't have even a national law, not to talk about a regional region, what would be the situation if you have not a trickle variety? It is going to be an exodus of refugees, right? And we only talk about it. That's why we thought in the new regionalism perspective, I think there will be some pressure groups, interest groups to really push forward this agenda. My last two questions, interventions is about, you referred to the river of sorrows in China, and how you mentioned about how you train a river and how the Chinese used human resources to really train this particular river. I was reading a literature written by the famous environmental journalist Mazun. I'll tell you about what really happened to Yellow River, which you are referring to, Huangho. Mazun, in his book, China's Water Crisis, in fact, I quoted this in one of my articles, he really states what really happened to Yellow River. I would just like to quote this because they are very interesting. Amazon, while commenting on the Yellow River, once the mother river in China, writes, I quote, the flow of this mother river began halting in 1972. And in 1997, not a single drop of water reached the sea for a 330-day period. The once mighty river has by now become a small, filthy stream that cannot even flush much of its sediments into the sea. But the Yellow River is no worse than situations on the North China Plain, most of whose 300 rivers are open sewers if they are not completely dry. So that is the situation. So therefore, what it also tells us about is how do we prepare ourselves to deal with the river systems. We have seen, I discussed with some of the authorities in the Northeast, they said, so our rivers, our streams, our rivulets are all drying up, right? But there is no discussion. So therefore, thank you for such a beautiful expositions. In fact, your physical presence would have been such a great inspiration to all of us working on issues of cooperation, integration, peace and development in South Asia. But please note that we are the flag bearers and you are the lead flag bearer in the entire game. So we remain alive, we remain kicking, and we will get to an end by just asserting what we are fully convinced to. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Lama.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Give concluding remarks.
Thank you, Ambassador Karim, and thank you, Dr. Jacob and Professor Lama. With this excellent lecture, we close the first day of this conference. On behalf of CSDR and Hans Siegel Foundation, I would like to thank all the speakers who joined us today, all the participants who were here, who took out time from their schedule to be with us today. We hope you can join us tomorrow. We have a shorter program as compared to today, and we hope that you can be there with us tomorrow. We have a small request to make of everyone. We have a feedback form, which would be behind the brochure that you've received. If you could please click on the link, there should be a way to fill a feedback form. We need your feedback regarding the program. That'll be very helpful. Please do join us for the reception dinner now. We have an early reception dinner lined up. It's in the Rose Garden. So once you exit this building and take a left, it'll be the first garden you see on your left, right behind this building. With this, we close the day. We'll close the conference for today. Thank you so much, Ambassador Karim, for joining us. It has been a pleasure listening to you.
Thank you. Check.